Hello and welcome. One of the things that I explore through this series is the idea that impact often exists in unexpected places, not just in the obvious impact sectors, but in the invisible systems, relationships, and translation work that shapes whether ideas actually move, scale, or create change. So we often assume that good ideas naturally will move from research into the real world. But in practice, as both my guest Hayley and I know, translation between sectors, institutions, and systems is often messy, relational, and very ineffective. In today's conversation, I am very excited. We're going to be talking about the invisible infrastructure that is underneath innovation and impact, translation, trust, and relationships, and the people that are doing the work between those systems. My guest today is Hayley McGillivray. Hayley is an innovation and collaboration strategist who specializes in university and industry collaboration and research translation. With more than 20 years' experience across industry, government innovation programs, global research collaborations, and academia, Hayley works at the intersection of research capability, industry adaptation, and innovation policy. Her doctoral research explores what actually makes collaboration work, including the role of relationships, brokerage, capability building, and the hidden outcomes traditional systems often fail to see. Hello, Hayley. How's it going?
Good, thank you. Thank you for having me. How are you?
Oh, I am good, thank you. I'm excited about this conversation. So, Hayley, you have spent years researching collaboration, and one of your conclusions is that almost anyone who's involved is measuring the wrong thing. What do you think that we're missing?
Yeah, I suppose I'd be hesitant to say we're measuring the wrong thing in that we are measuring things that matter. But I think a lot of what we measure is based on accessible metrics or things that can be quantified or captured quite easily. Definitely things that are kind of anticipated or expected. So you sort of, because often it's in association with success, which is defined around the aim of doing something. But I think what that means is that we actually fail to measure a lot of those slightly less tangible things. So that is additional outcomes or softer, less tangible benefits, and also the benefits or outcomes that maybe don't come with immediacy to the activity. They might be created in the activity, but the value from it comes later. It might be in combination or in other settings. So I think if we want to really understand the whole value or potential of these things, we're potentially overlooking some of the metrics that we should look at.
I think that really resonates with a lot of the work that I've been doing as well, which is, you're working within a sector or within an industry that very much values what you can measure is what you can see and what you can measure equals that is something concrete that I feel that I can do something against. Whereas what you're saying and what my research also said that actually is not correct. Is that kind of what you're saying in your question, in your answer, that there's a lot of hidden things that should be measured that are not being measured?
Yeah, and I think probably the premise that I come from is I'm not saying it's not correct to measure that. Absolutely. And it's important, right, that we have metrics or we have that understanding. But I think by focusing on only those metrics, we sometimes forget to appreciate the other outcomes and benefits. So, for example, you may take part in a collaborative research project for a specific purpose. And we know that research and development by its very nature is quite uncertain. So it may not produce what you go in with. Well, does that mean it's a fail? Or potentially we've learned so much and we've developed so much and all these other things have come out of that become important down the track, almost seeds to the next piece. So I think maybe we need to step away from this kind of black and white thinking that's informed by some of those more traditional metrics that we're only successful if we do this.
So, Hayley, you started as a geologist. You had a little bit of an unexpected journey to where you are right now. You started off as a geologist and you ended up researching why collaboration between institutions so often struggles. So tell me about what happened in between. How did that inform where you're thinking and what you're thinking right now? And did you play with rocks when you were a child?
Great questions. I did like rocks when I was a child. Certainly my children love them, and I'm the parent that always lets them pick them up. I think the journey, sort of as I was experiencing it, was kind of one of those things that didn't really make sense. I was sort of tumbling through, it felt like.
As a geologist, you were tumbling through.
Well,
Was that
you know
was
what?
that a dad joke?
I actually loved being a geologist, but I really, really enjoyed kind of the strategy that sits behind that and the process of exploration. That always fascinated me. And then at multiple occasions with different companies, so with smaller junior explorers as well as larger companies, I was offered choices. You know, do you want to continue progressing as a geologist, or maybe, you know, it might be a slightly slower path, but we've got these research and development projects, would you like to look after that? And every time I chose looking after the R&D, I really enjoyed these projects and that creation of new knowledge and then implementing it and seeing, you know, what could it mean and working with the teams on that. And so after I had my children, my daughters, I really wasn't wanting to fly in and out anymore, and was offered work to kind of come across to the other side with research organisations. Would you like to work with us to build those projects for industry? So I got to experience a lot more on the other side, which was great. And then through that, I ended up getting a role delivering one of our federal programs here to support businesses with their innovation efforts, writing their roadmaps and helping them building their research projects and managing that portfolio, and I think that sort of led me to where we are today in doing that work and seeing the projects, having sat on quite a few of the different sides, and, you know, observing firsthand that we build the projects for this reason, but actually they do so much more, and we don't have the words for it, the language for it, or talk about it. That frustrated me because it wasn't well recognized, and I couldn't find the information, and I couldn't find the information in academia either. You know, it reached a point where I rolled up my sleeves and thought I'll do a PhD and figure some of this out.
So that's interesting that your pathway to doing a PhD was wanting to investigate something a little bit deeper and to try and find a solution to it. Can you give me an example of when you felt like the translation piece was really not working for you and the frustration was really, really high for you around that?
Yeah, I think there's probably a few examples that are, you know, if you're working with people who maybe haven't engaged in these sorts of projects before, or going in to talk to people about it and what does this look like, but you don't really have that process model or way to discuss that. I mean, we often revert to every project is different, and that's a narrative that we hear about a lot of these things, which is true, but I think that can almost provide an even bigger barrier of unfamiliarity around it that's sort of only overcome through aggregations or building of experience, having experienced it. But that means that there's this real barrier for people who haven't yet but maybe would like to understand a bit more before they come in. So being able to help people with that, I think, is important. I think for me, capabilities was a massive focus of the PhD, and the reason for that is you see these capabilities being built, but it's really hard to name them, particularly when they're around, you know, collaborating, relationship building, a lot of these other sides, which means they're often overlooked, they're not planned for, but also they're lost and not built on and recognized. And so I just felt that was really important as a piece of work to help provide some of that insight and language for that, to help people with recognizing what they might have.
So again, just to make it a little bit more concrete, because I think we talk, especially if we have been in academia in PhD world for a while, how do you translate that into what government is actually needing? So I can see how there's a disconnect there in terms of like both capabilities on both sides, you know, like government speaks a specific language, community speaks a different language, and the tools that we were given working for government were not necessarily the tools that were required or that working with community. And then there's the issue of like community trying to work with government, and there's, you know, a whole bunch of different legacy ideas there. So can you give me an example of, from an R&D perspective specifically, because that's where a lot of your pain came out of. Can you give me an example of a project that you worked on that would showcase that you're like, okay, this is a frustration, and this is specifically with, you know, with group A, this is what happened, with group B, this is what happened.
Yeah, look, do you know what? I think it's really interesting because, and one of the things that kind of stood out with the PhD is that actually the research and case studies that I did, they were all perceived as successful projects, even if they may or may not have landed up where people expected or wanted them to originally. And I think that that's really important, going back to that perception of success. And I think, when you've worked in this space between them, there's probably many examples of where things have started to, there's plenty of opportunities for those disconnects to happen. You have industry that's working on industry timeframes, it's working on, they need to get that outcome, working on specific challenges that they want to do. And then you've got academics who are really used to working in quite a different way under different environments as well, producing new knowledge, exploring lots of ideas. And kind of there's potential tensions throughout these projects. And you could talk to specific examples of where these things may happen. There's examples where that first meeting, everyone felt they're talking completely different languages. They don't feel they can work together. No one's thinking outside of their space to be able to connect. There could be examples where what people wanted to be delivered wasn't delivered. It was too slow. Expectations were mismatched. There can always be that. I think what I like about the research is it's providing that framework of what happens in the projects and what do we do in there to start to build the processes and capabilities that overcome this. So for example, the people that work between those facilitators and brokers, how they work initially, maybe talking to each of the partners to build their understanding of what the other partner might want and help highlight where that resonance is, so that first conversation is much more productive and finds those synergies. How those expectations are set around, this is a collaborative project, it's not about either of your worlds, this is what we need to do in here, and you set those foundations for that. The way they kind of evaluate the project risk, the people in their relationship, the capabilities that are in there, which of these can we step back off more, do we think is going to go well? And then we see that they kind of move into this space as the project's going, that sort of lets that project go ahead while still checking in to identify with their experience, that's something that could become a problem, let's work around this. I don't necessarily think it's about a solution to the two worlds paradox, I guess. I think it's about demonstrating how we can really proactively work towards overcoming it, and that, it can create barriers, but it can also create absolute benefits and opportunities as well.
I mean, I think that it sounds to me like a lot of the things that you're talking about is around, good ideas struggling to move between different worlds. So, for example, academia and industry and government. I mean, I know that within Australia, it's often talked about the challenge of, being able to commercialize or bring a lot of the research that is within academia into industry. But it sounds to me like you're saying things that are very, I guess, universal. Like it's like, well, what I'm hearing you say, and not to definitely 100% not to dilute the importance of the stuff that you found, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but more that it sounds to me like what you're saying is, look, here's a playground. You guys have to, play together and find a common language in order for you to be able to succeed. Is that what you're saying? Like, or is there something that's deeper than that? I'm assuming it's 100% deeper than that.
Well, I think more fundamentally, it goes back to this piece, which is, if we know we're from two different worlds and we've worked out kind of what we might want to do, which is that focus of the project, we don't spend enough time thinking about how we're going to do it. And I don't mean technically how. I mean, how are we going to work together? How are we going to do this? How am I going to let you know about my world? And how am I going to learn about yours? And it's those bits in these really relational projects that actually kind of build those capabilities, relationships, and additional opportunities that create the additional value and really support the success in my mind. And so I think sometimes we're so focused on saying we need to commercialize, we need to do this, we need to do that. It's a translation problem, and this is not the space of the research, but maybe we could ask, how do we build the ecosystem that commercialize it? Maybe it's less of a specific action that, that would still happen, but maybe it's founded on relationships, capabilities, trust, people getting used to working together at a much earlier stage rather than one creating, one commercializing, and negotiation around that transfer in between. So
See,
that's kind of the thinking I have at what I look at, is that focus of how.
Yeah, which is something, again, you're talking about hidden forces or hidden things that are not necessarily measured or often not prioritized, even though they're essential to a success of something. So give me an example of someone, based on your research, what does someone look like who's really good at connecting between those different worlds? But also, what kind of tools do they need to have in order to be able to convince, and I'm air quoting convince, the powers to be who are working on a collaborative project to pay attention and to take time to be able to build that space?
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
I would hope so.
And I think sort of the most interesting thing in there is it's, what does that look like, right? And actually, so, I will caveat this by saying my research looks at case studies in a very specific setting. So small to medium businesses working with academia one-to-one under these programs. But actually, the people who connect, so those brokers or facilitators, it actually it doesn't look like much, right? Because it's really invisible work. But when you see what's happening, it's a lot. And it's important work. So it is about building trust with both parties independently to understand their concerns, reservations, where their understanding's at, where their capabilities at, and helping to rapidly build that without exposing them to one another. So it doesn't destroy any chance of creating, that trust between them at the early stage and that rapport that you need. It's helping them to have those conversations, to find those synergies. It's, we all have to go through contracting, and it's that kind of reframe as, we might think about it, yes, this is a necessary exercise and it creates that formal governance and piece of paper, but equally in the lead up to this, what we're doing is we're talking about what matters to us and why, and it's putting boundaries around the project and helping people to understand that. And it's often, it's seen as something that's really onerous or terrible that we have to do, but actually it's a really good learning opportunity to work through that. And all of that happens before we even start the project formally, which means we've got a really good chance to build that understanding of one another. And then, the people who are those connectors that you asked about, they actually do highly skilled work to be able to understand, what does this project look like in terms of weaknesses, risks, from people, from technical project, from project structure as well. What do I need to pay attention to, and what am I more confident in? So kind of plugging any gaps there might be, enabling that project as best it can, and then letting those people go. But they don't just let them go. They've done all of this work at the front end to kind of empower it for success. And then we see this transition where the collaborators become the leaders of the project. So they're all invested, they're working on it, they're working together, there's expectations about how. And we see these brokers or facilitators kind of step back, and they do. What was really interesting is they do this quite informal check-in. So there's some formal check-in pieces associated with programs, but they also just see them. And there was a lot of conversation or evidence in here that showed that people didn't really know how much the brokers knew, because each party may reach out if there was something that was worrying them or they weren't that sure about, or ask for help, or they might bump into each other a few times. They're in the same networks. How's things going? And they can kind of get that feel from both parties to see what's going on and really get this kind of overall sense of it. And really they were just seen as, oftentimes as a peer in there. And the brokers did speak to projects. None of them were the case studies, but that they had experiences where things had perhaps got a bit difficult, and that's when they might more formally come in to get these things back on track, really working with the team to set this going and recalibrate. But it was really interesting to see that a lot of that work, if it was done really well, basically what happens is that both the partners feel like they have a really great relationship. They worked super well together. They produced all this amazing stuff, and it was really feeling quite smooth because a lot of these foundations had been set without without people really knowing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's, in the work that I've done in the past in community economic development and community development, you definitely, like, I think that the aspect of being able to create a common language or a common dictionary and being able to kind of actually dig down into, okay, well, I say is to be able to kind of say, when I say the word impact, you are going to think of one thing, the next person is going to think of something else, and the third person is going to think of something completely different. And I think that that's something to be celebrated. But I also think that when we're working on projects together, or when we're like, when it comes to, for example, the industry and academia collaboration, you need to be able to kind of find what are some of the friction points that you're making a lot of assumptions around the translation that is going on around what one person interprets when you say a word versus what the other person says. So when you're talking about brokers, which what I'm understanding from what you're saying is that they basically are the ones that kind of help facilitate and create that initial conversation. Is that a formal role or an informal role? And how do you, like, is it a new job title? Do I get to be one? Like, is this gonna be a future job title of like, I am an industry academia broker. Hire me.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a whole load of research around this as well, and a lot of people would identify as this. You've got kind of people who sit in those roles within academic institutions. You've got industry engagement offices, you've got the research office, those people who work in that space. The case studies that I did were around specific programs that were built for this. So one was a federal government program, and there was another one as well. So that was a facilitated program. So there were people who were facilitators in there. You have intermediary organisations and institutions, so the organisations or the people within there could be as well. And then, we see informal brokers too. So definitely in the literature, there's examples of, academics who have worked in this space a lot, developing the capabilities to be able to do this. See, in my research, there's definitely evidence of how they develop those capabilities through participation, showing the roles that they take on and the aspects to that, how they use capabilities in kind of bridging or blurring, we might call it, so really reaching towards one another as well. So I think, definitely it's a term that's increasingly important, and I think those roles are seen as increasingly important, and in a variety of settings as well.
Interesting. So what was the thing that surprised you most about your research?
Yeah, I think there's probably a few things. When you're working in this space, you're in every project, you're working on it. And, I've spoken before to how we sort of speak to every project being different. Every project's different, you don't really know. But I think working across those case studies and being able to create that process and also language around the capabilities, how learning's developed, how different outcomes are created, that was really interesting for me, because it is different depending on who the person is, who the partnership is, and who the project is. And I sort of used processes in the terms practices, because different people might do it in different ways, but there were common things that you could see happening. And I certainly didn't have that language or understanding before to be able to say this is what I was doing. And so I think that has really surprised me with how useful it is in terms of being able to place terminology with those things that are often completely unseen or difficult to describe or hard to recognize in that way. And I think, I did go in with experience in this space and feeling like there was something more. But it's been really interesting to look at the same projects from multiple different perspectives of people who were involved, and actually have the time in those conversations for a lot to come out that maybe they wouldn't have even connected to the projects as well. And to understand exactly what they can do and how they can work and what it can mean for organizations, partnerships, and individuals. It's been really interesting to do that, despite having experience of working in that world. We just don't get to always know that.
A different question, but I'll ask the question that I was thinking about first. So when is there, aside from it being with the findings that you have from your PhD and applying them, I mean, both you and I have shared how the purpose of doing the PhD was not necessarily to move into academia, but rather to be able to translate it into our careers and into industry. So can you talk to me a little bit about how you find the findings or the research that you've done and the outcomes of the research? Do you feel that that is helping you in trying to navigate that transition? Because it's not an easy transition to do.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah.
there's a couple of things in there. It's been a really big journey for me. Like you say, I started off to solve an industry problem or a problem that I had. The whole experience has definitely opened my mind to research, and I've truly enjoyed it in that. I think in terms of translating it, it's actually been, as someone who's worked in that space and been like, no, but we need to take this research and translate it into industry problems or articulate things better. And I've helped a lot of people do that, but to do it with your own research is incredibly hard, particularly when you've spent the best part of 3.5 years building your knowledge and language around it using this vocabulary as well. So yeah, I find that really, really difficult, and it's something that I think is going to take dedicated time and purpose to work on as well, to be able to really make this in its best usable form, I guess. For people, and to make sure it solves a problem, and it's one that people want solved.
Yeah, I think that I think that one of the things that we have in common in terms of our research has to do with the aspect of translation, right? You're translating between academia and industry. I'm trying to translate between finance and founders, and it's the same. There's a lot of similarities around that, and I think that the translation, if we're both working in the translation world, being able to translate that translation into a different industry should be relatively easy, but I think that it comes with its own challenges that have to do with working within specific spaces, having a specific narrative that you're used to, being conditioned to a certain environment, and then having to move to a different environment that has a different type of narrative and a different type of industry thinking, or a different type of thinking. So what are some of the things, this is totally putting you on the spot, but what are some of the things that you feel that you can take from the essence of your PhD or from the essence of the research that you found that you could potentially recommend to someone who's who's moving between worlds and is trying to translate? Because you're talking about academia and industry, and you're saying you need a brokerage in order for that to happen, and you need to have common language around that. And we're both trying to translate something from one specific industry into another. So there's got to be some kind of key findings or key points that you can kind of point to and say, okay, I would recommend for someone that is trying to translate from A to B to use these specific principles.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And
I just thought of it.
No, because, it's interesting that the research is also, echoes some of what we're doing. I would say that, the research specifically is around collaborative projects and that co-creation. But what I would say are the principles that we see in there is it's about knowledge flow, right? And we often assume that knowledge comes from academia and goes into industry. Whereas actually what the case studies have shown is much more of an environment of co-creation where people have been purposefully working together. They're getting to know one another. They're creating additional opportunities for one another around this. And that's about openness and trust being built and having the capabilities for that. It's about, they move from having each partner having distinct capabilities to actually building mutual project capabilities as well. So if I think about that and what I'm doing, I'm out here and I've found the research that I've done, what are the opportunities? Who might be the kind of partners that would like to use this or extend this or work with me on further developing it? How can I get to know people who might be on the other side to understand what they're doing in this space and to build that relationship where I can share some of what I know and I can understand more about you that might create different opportunities as well. And I think it's really around that bilateral knowledge flow where, what, I've spent 3.5 years working on this myself, but it's not going to be a complete solution to something. Like, I know why I did it from an industry perspective and how I think I might use it myself. But if I want this to be something that's more commercial, I need to build those relationships or use those relationships I know to be able to share and also to hear. And it's not necessarily going to go the direction that I think it might. You know, it might broaden things as well, but I need to have that openness also to understanding how people might want to use it, or how they might think it needs to be changed. And I think that that's probably, you know, I don't want to breeze over these things and say, well, you know, this is what we see and this is what we have to do, because you've spent years working on something and you can be quite attached to it. So it's definitely, you know, it's vulnerable work to do those things. But yeah, certainly I'm of the perspective that that's where the magic comes in these ecosystems, where we can start to have trust, have openness, invite people in early, have the capabilities to do that, and then the mechanisms to actually take things forward in a meaningful way.
So this question is in two parts. First of all, what is your definition of impact?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I would say at the highest level, impact is meaningful change.
Okay. The
impact is going to be different to everyone, because what they think is meaningful or what they notice to have changed is going to be different.
If you've worked across academia, government, research, industry, so how has moving between those worlds changed how you think about impact?
I think it certainly helped me to understand that impact is different to people who sit in different aspects of, you know, in those different sectors, right? And that it's not a right or wrong situation, and neither one's necessarily more important than another. So, you know, if we're coming together to work, you know, I understand industry has to improve its ways of doing things, reduce impact of what it's doing, answer to shareholders, you know, it has a lot of things that it needs to address, and in certain timeframes, because that is how it's built. And academia also, you know, people want to publish, their reward systems in there are set up to recognise something else, right? It's fundamentally different. And then we've got government that's, you know, it's working in spaces of policy, security, national priorities as well, and these programs kind of can come down from there. I think what's really important for me, what makes it less confusing, is if I can understand what those priorities are for everyone, and then kind of you can see how can we create the win-win or the win-win-win across all of that, and how can we do that in a really smart way. So, you know what, just by stopping, again, thinking about how we're doing it, well, we might be collecting success metrics that align to our priorities, but maybe we could also stop and think about it and collect what we need across all of them for a program to help you provide success metrics and things. So thinking about things in those ways and moving to understanding, I guess, those differences, and seeing how we can work across them and help one another, I think that could really create some change for us all.
And is that how you would link your, do you believe that the work that you're doing is fueled by wanting to make a difference and wanting to make, to see that change, which is what your definition of impact is?
Yeah. So I think for me, the impact I would love to see, that's kind of that meaningful difference to me, I would love it if we started to think beyond a singular project. So we don't just look at one project for that specific outcome. We start to recognise the capabilities that are built, the expertise in building this, the role of this in creating ecosystems with capabilities, new ideas from across them, organisations that have kind of legitimacy from partnerships that they're doing. We start to recognise all of this. So, you know, I guess in your world, we might think about what's a innovation ecosystem that commercialises, for example, with investors, all the different structured bits. What I'd love to see is, you know, how do we see the activities that happen in there like a project and recognise them as almost engine rooms that create the people, the capabilities, the relationships, the ideas that activate that. And how does that create a much more enduring, self-sustaining ecosystem?
Why do you feel that this journey of the PhD, of trends of moving between, you started off as a geologist, playing with rocks, working with mining, working more towards the R&D, the work that you do with your consulting company, and now, becoming a PhD and also being a mom and a partner and juggling all of these different things. How do you feel that journey has changed you personally?
So how has it changed me as a person?
I mean, I can speak about how I feel that the PhD has changed me. I feel that I came into it with a very specific outcome that I was looking for, and theoretically understanding that I was using a specific tool to be able to accomplish something that I wanted at the end, which had to do with my career. And I theoretically understood that that I'm using a specific tool that is not designed for that, right? Like a PhD is not designed to be implemented into industry. It's designed for you to understand how to critically think and how to research and how to be able to look at a subject from a whole bunch of different perspectives. And it was a different language translating between when we first met. We were talking about how, moving from learning how to speak from an industry perspective to learning how to think from a academia perspective. So I can say that the way that a PhD changes you in so many different ways. For me, it changed me. I think that I think differently now. I try and I use bigger words, which I try not to. Maybe I overcomplicate things that could be more simplified. But I think as a person, it's changed me because I feel that it's provided me with tools about how to frame my thinking, how to analyze specific things, and how to translate, really, because I still work in those two different worlds, how to try and understanding how complicated that journey is, and how you need to be able to really be true to yourself and be true to a lot of the things that are important to you, and clarify and simplify in order to be able to accomplish the goal. What are some of the things that you think about? How does this journey change you?
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. I actually loved hearing that about you as someone who's sort of gone alongside you on this journey. And I think you're right, it's not an easy, straightforward answer. I guess sort of at the highest level across a lot of those things, what it has connected for me is that I really care about how we do things, thinking about how we do it, learning from it, optimizing, creating environments in which amazing work can happen. And I've worked and continue to work in the mining industry and researching in the business school as well. And I think this area of university industry collaboration is a real passion of mine. You wouldn't do a PhD in it otherwise. And I think fundamentally, I just believe that the way we've always done things is not the way we need to do things moving forward. And I truly believe in science, research and development and innovation as the catalyst that, helps us build that better world. The PhD itself, I think taking the time to have been able to really think deeply, build knowledge, learn, that felt like such a privilege as an older woman. To be able to go back and do that, that's a luxury. That's not to say it's been easy, but absolutely it's been a luxury and privilege to be able to do that and to do it aligned to an area that's, kind of come out as my passion. That's been amazing as well. And I've gone from being trained as a geologist, which is very much, positivist, black and white, yes and no, to doing social science and qualitative research and understanding that there's a spectrum of experiences. My work's sort of naturally taken me to some of the softer side and the enabling side, but really grounding into that has been very, very helpful as well. And you asked about being a mum, and I will say one thing. I actually put off doing a PhD for years because I was very worried about the impact it would have on my daughters. Are they going to miss out on me? Am I always going to be studying? Are they going to resent me for this? So we're just coming to the end of the PhD now, and I have a 10-year-old and 12-year-old.
Wonderful.
And they're awesome. They're actually super proud of it. About a year into the PhD, something really interesting happened in our family, which was that the girls, they announced these really big goals around the dinner table. So for one of them, it was, I want to be music captain. And the other one, I want to be part of the musical that my dance school's doing. We have to rehearse 2 to 3 times a week on top of everything else. And there was just this assumption of support from the family. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And I remember, quite early in the piece, I had conversations with them and I said, I've just done this piece of work. And it was at the beginning when I was doing some of the training courses to learn how to do qualitative research. And I said, I've had some feedback about it. So mum's got 2 options. I can either hand it in as it is and we'll spend the weekend, or I can work at the weekend to make it better for when I have to hand it in on Monday. What do you think I should do? And they were like, oh, Mum, you've got to make it better. We'll bring you snacks. We'll come and check in on you. And so I did. But actually, now my daughter's in high school, I think it's been really helpful for her to see me doing homework or, work and studying. And she's now got a desk up here in the study as well for when she does her homework. And I think I had not understood, we tell our daughters they can be anything, they can do anything. We always think as parents about what the cost of us doing something is, and we never actually think about kind of what we're role modeling for them, what they could do. And I wasn't expecting that, and I'm forever grateful that hopefully it's had some positive effects on them in that way.
That's a great answer. Thank you. I have 2 more questions. One is just going back to the concept of impact. I kind of feel that for me personally, we've talked a lot about the concept of congruency of, the thoughts, the values and the actions and the way that you speak and how you interact with the world, and the importance of making sure that we're talking and walking our values. And the work that we do, that both of us are doing, is very much powered by our desire to be able to shape a different type of future. How do you navigate that? Because I think that, you're working in very different environments that might not necessarily always allow for that to show up, right? If I think about, for example, investing and the investors that I have spoken to in my research, none of them, aside from one, none of them said to me, oh, the reason I invest is to be able to make money. But when I talk to them about, okay, well, how do you make decisions, or what does impact mean to you? Sometimes that didn't connect. Right? And even though they subconsciously were doing something, and the way that they were making decisions were based on who they are as someone who navigates all of these different worlds. And what you're asking and what part of your research is about actually taking a minute to kind of realign and to check in with the other person, and to be able to say, this is what I'm thinking, is this what you're thinking? And I relate that in some way to being authentic, and to be able to walk in the world with clarity and congruency, which is powered by what I believe I want the world to be.
I've long been a human who naturally has been fascinated by how we do things and learnt in that way. And, before I did the PhD, I can remember saying, if you want me to build projects, I'm not really interested in building a transaction. I feel like you can build a transaction yourselves. I'm interested in building collaboration. And I think what's been really interesting in the research, it's reinforced my conviction in that. But it's also challenged it, because it's shown me that, that kind of transaction, if you might call it, in my research I refer to it as the focal opportunity. So this is that pre-designed purpose of why we're going to do it, that we contract for, that we do all of that. That's actually a really important pathway that kind of mobilizes motivation for the project and resources to the project. But the environment that's built around that, which is that human side, the capabilities, the understanding, the relationships, and how we build that and those interactions, that shapes the nature of the environment of that project. And so we're saying, you can build that formal thing that might be that, research has knowledge that you want applied to this specific problem, and it will flow that way. But still around that, we can build these highly relational projects, safe environments that allow iterating, sharing, integration of feedback, learning more about each other's organizations, we see people creating additional opportunities and outcomes attached to this, and sustained relationships that last far longer, and outcomes that they take and transform into all sorts of different, whole variety that these projects do. And I think that what it's done for me is, I'm not saying, sometimes the world we live in can feel quite transactive, and I'm not actually saying we don't need that. What I'm saying is, hey, I want to help, but I want to help build something that can offer even more around it. If we're going to do this, let's think about how we're going to do it and what it looks like, because we can potentially do so much more around it as well. Not as a trade-off, not at the expense of that, but actually around it. And I think that that's now sort of where I'm thinking, So if we go back to impact, for example, and I said at the beginning, we measure a lot of these tangible metrics. So for example, we might have a program that builds these and it looks at patents produced or research publications. And there's no reason to dismiss that, like I said, but equally, maybe we also want to take the time to track what happens after the projects, or ask people around, what did you learn from this project? And maybe even, ask them, so that we don't default to that kind of technical learning. What would you do differently next time? We need to ask some of these things, or start to use language around what all these different outcomes could look like, and see that, because maybe if you're thinking, if I was designing a program, I would put facilitators in there, but I'd be, what systematic change do we see as a result of that? Does the overall number of collaborations increase over time because people have learned how to do it? Not just between those two parties, but do they take those capabilities and partner with other people as well? And I think that's sort of, it's changed my thinking from being, I don't want to do this, I only want to do this, to actually being like, cool, we're doing this, let me think about how we can do even more while we're doing this.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a really good answer. Thank you. So one last question before we wrap this up. What are some tangible tools or frameworks or points that you would like a listener who is watching or listening to this, and they're like, okay, well, that's great, we talked about a lot of things, but what can I walk away with? So what's like a tool or framework that you use that is related to your PhD or not related to your PhD that has helped you move through something specific that has to do with collaboration or that has to do with translation between worlds?
Yeah. Do you know what? I'm going to give you a slightly different answer, and I'm actually going to talk about the use of tools.
Good. Do it.
So, and this is part of the reason that I wanted to do the PhD, to create the process and stuff, because I think it can be translated into tools. And we've got some really good examples, right? Business model canvases, lean canvases. So I was involved quite early in my career with an organization that rolled out some training. And what was really interesting is that the training was about doing something specific. It was around sales, right? Which wasn't exactly what we do, but, relevant tools. And in what I saw through doing that training and becoming sort of one of their internal subject matter experts, I could see something really interesting happened. And what it was is it provided people with language to use for certain things, and it was common language. So you could see them asking questions like, have you identified this persona or role within here? And the other person was understanding what that meant. And so that was really useful to help them have what could be otherwise difficult conversations. The other thing that was really interesting is there were kind of these sheets of paper at the time, which were the tools. And they were hard conversations to have because it was about that sense making or making meaning potentially across a boundary, a knowledge boundary, as you might call it, or understanding boundary. But there was no frustration between the people. It was, we have to work this out because we need to do this in the tool. And so it kind of joined them as a team to achieve. And that's where I really got to thinking, the value of the language, making the implicit work explicit as much as you can, providing, not being prescriptive, like you must do these steps and in this way it must always look the same, but providing that framework or tool that guides people through so they've got an awareness of, well, this is what we're doing and this is the purpose and why, and we already know what's going to come next, so we are feeling less lost in this. I think that's really, really valuable. And I hope to be able to take the research and the understanding that we have into something in that way for people to be able to work and use to support that, because I think that's why tools really matter and how they make a difference.
Amazing. Thank you. That's a good way to end. Do you have any questions for me before we end?
So you've started doing these interviews here.
Yes.
You know, and obviously a lot of it's around impact, and a lot of your PhD was around impact. And you had an idea before doing these interviews what you wanted to do. Has that changed while you've done? I know we're doing the first few.
No, I still think that it is fascinating to hear how things unfold when you start asking people questions. And a lot of people want to know what the questions are ahead of time. And I'm like, I can send you some points, but the question, and I have questions, by the way, I have like 12 questions, and out of the 12 questions, we maybe covered 3, because I think that I'm a very curious person, and I like finding out where people are going with their thoughts. And I still believe that we have such a white, right? You have to make a decision. Is it, are you doing this or are you doing that? And are you an academic or are you industry? Are you an investor or are you a founder? Are you impact investor or non-impact investor? Are you this or are you that? And I think that really we want to think that is the right way, but in reality, a lot of the decisions and a lot of the things that happen are those conversations in between and the spaces in between and in that gray area, right? And so the whole purpose of what I'm trying to do is really to provide opportunities for people to kind of peer into other people's brains and ways of thinking, to be able to kind of say like, hold on, I never thought about industry, academia, collaboration as something that is impact. That would be interesting to figure out why they think that it's impact and how do they, and maybe there's something from that conversation that I can then take to my world and figure out how I can apply that. And that's really something that I feel is really important, because the more that we bind ourselves to very specific positions, which feel safe and feel comfortable, the less we have the opportunity of being able to know the other and to build more collaborative, connected, and important conversations that shift the way that we think and shift the way that we act and shift the way that we perceive the world. So I feel very grateful for people that are willing to come on and have random conversations with me that we don't know where they're going to lead. And I hope that, I really hope that the goal of it is accomplished, that people listen to these conversations and are like, I learned something new. Great. So yeah, that's all.
I love that. No, I think,
all right, well,
we co-create the conversation, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time, Hayley. I really appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for watching, and looking forward to the next conversation. Thanks, Hales.
Bye.